I know, shamefully, very little about Australian comics. There's a bit in the second Scott Pilgrim book in which Scott's trying to insist that he does know stuff about Rome, and the comic takes us inside his head and says these are Scott's ideas about Rome, and you see the Leaning Tower, Spicy Meatball, Vespas, the Pope of Rome. And although I'm not that bad, it's pretty similar to how it would be if you ask me about Australian comics. I'd go, there's The Arrival and Sean Tan, there's Pat Grant's Blue, Simon Hanselman, Dylan Horrocks. No, he's from New Zealand, so that's my Pope of Rome moment. I've recently gotten to know the works of Campbell, Whyte, and Chris Gooch, and although I'm aware of some comics creators like Eddie Campbell or Ben Templesmith, Tom Taylor, who are from Australia, I'm not at all familiar with indigenous, local Australian publishing in comics for Australian audiences. In fact, although I'm not familiar with Japanese or French markets, let alone Brazilian, German, at least I'm aware that there is a history of publishing comics or a readership or a fandom of comics that are locally produced in those countries, whereas that's not the case with Australia. However, even the quickest of Wikipedia searches showed me that Australia actually has a long history of comics publishing dating back to the 1910s and newspaper comics that were the contemporaries of things that were being produced by Winsor McCay in the United States, for example. And the history of comics in Australia has also been affected by things like the World Wars, paper shortages, ban on American or UK imports or reprints, which includes a healthy attitude towards self-publishing and small presses, which is why I was so excited to hear from Mark Pearson at Glom Press in Australia, who reached out to me asking if he could send me a package sampling of some of the comics that they publish. This package arrived a while ago, but I'm only now getting to opening it. On their website, which I'll link in the description below, Glom Press state that their mission is to fill a gap between mini-comics and graphic novels. And I think that's instantly obvious by looking at these 10 books. They're all singular, idiosyncratic works, and they've been produced that way as well. All of these comics are printed on a risograph, which is like an advanced photocopier, or it's similar to mimeograph technology. I'm not really very familiar, but it has a very distinctive look and seems very capable of reproducing a variety of different art techniques. There are 2 comics that are center stapled, more traditionally the zine or the mini comic format, but again with very high quality paper and printing, not the cheap copier paper that self-published mini comic might be on. 8 of these books are perfect bounds, so they really do feel like small little notebooks. And although a couple of the design choices may seem like they're trying to replicate mass market paperbacks or other things we know like that, they really do have an individual identity. They don't feel like graphic novels and they don't feel like mini comics. Now, what happens with comics like these, what happens with mini comics, what happens with self-published works, is that they tend to be very idiosyncratic. They tend to be odd for some people. They might be dealing with subject matter or presenting it in a way that doesn't seem to people who read mainstream comics to be very polished, for example. But I think that's the whole point of small presses, self-publishing, and mini comics. They're here to represent very individual voices. Some people who work with comics in a way that others don't. Others may not even be comics creators full-time. They may be artists working in other fields and are trying to see what they can do with the vocabulary of comics, and experimenting with the form or even just exploring the form from different points of views always leads to very interesting results. By giving each of these authors a very individual stage to perform on, what small presses do is allow for a variety of voices to both be discovered and to develop as people find their own voice working in smaller sized pieces. And each one has a very unique flavor. Alongside the neat and handsome binding, the quality paper, there's this judicious use of duotone in many of these comics, something that we've seen in bigger mainstream comics like Darwin Cook's Parker or Tillie Walden's Spinning, the comics of Box Brown, for example, and many others. And all of these come across as really beautiful objects because they strike such a good balance between the handmade feel and the produced book feel.